Muscles presentation by Ruben Simmons for Basvik Sports and Exercise Science. In our body, there are three types of muscles: skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. Skeletal muscle is the most common type of muscle in our body. They work voluntarily, meaning we control their movement and contractions. They are attached to bones by tendons and are responsible for all our major limb movements. Skeletal muscles often exist in pairs, which include a prime mover and an antagonist. They contain both type 1 and 2 muscle fibers and can therefore contract both fast and slowly. These muscle fibers are connected via connective tissue and work with nerves and blood vessels. In addition, since both muscle fibers are contained in skeletal muscle, it works both aerobically and anaerobically. Cardiac muscle is the least common type of muscle in the body, as it is only found lined in the walls of your heart. They work involuntarily, meaning we have no control over their movement and contractions. These contractions allow your heart to pump blood through your circulatory system. The nervous system sends signals to pacemaker cells contained in cardiac muscle, which control the contractions of your heart. The signals force these specialized cells to either speed up or slow down your heart rate. These cells are also connected to other cardiac muscle cells in order to pass along the signal, creating a wave of contractions which, in turn, creates your heartbeat. Cardiac muscle also only contains type 1 fibers, meaning it contracts slowly and works aerobically. Smooth muscle, like cardiac and differentiating from skeletal, also retains involuntary movement and contractions. It can only be found lining the walls of the body's hollow organs, such as the intestines. Smooth muscle is involved in, nicknamed, many housekeeping functions of the body. In the walls of your intestines, they contract to push food. In your bladder, they contract to expel urine. And women, only women, also have smooth muscle located in their uterus, which contract when appropriate to aid with childbirth. As smooth muscle only contains type 1 fibers, it contracts slowly and works aerobically. This slide contains two pictures of the body. One of the anterior view of the muscles, and two of the posterior view of the muscles. Combined, they list all the muscles in our body. Please take a moment to pause the slide if you wish to look at the names of the muscles in further detail. The origin of a muscle is the point at which it attaches to a stationary bone or another muscle, usually a stationary bone, while the insertion of a muscle is the end of the muscle, which attaches to the freely moving bone of the joint in question. Please take a moment to pause the video and study this table of origin and insertions, which also includes the functions. In our body, there are three types of muscle fibers: type 1, type 2A, and type 2B. Type 1 muscle fibers are most commonly known as slow twitch muscle fibers, as they contract slowly. They have a high capacity for ATP, which stands for adenosine triphosphate, a very dense capillary network, produce high levels of intercellular myoglobin and mitochondria, and have an aerobic metabolism. They are red in colour because of their very dense capillary network and high level of production of intercellular myoglobin. Sporting examples of type 1 include 10,000 metre run and marathons. Type 2A muscle fibers are more commonly known as fast oxidative fibers. They have a fast production rate of ATP and produce a higher number of mitochondria and intercellular myoglobin, but not as high as type 1. They can also use both aerobic and anaerobic metabolism to create energy. In this particular way, they can be seen as both a combination of type 1 and type 2 muscle fibers. They have a densely packed capillary network and so are therefore, like type 1, red in colour. Sporting examples of type 2A include a 400 metre and an 800 metre run. Type 2B muscle fibers are more commonly known as fast glycolytic muscle fibers. They have a slow production rate of ATP compared with type 1 and type 2A, and produce a low number of mitochondria and intercellular myoglobin. They also have an anaerobic metabolism, and because of their lack of a densely packed capillary network, they are white in colour. Sporting examples include a 100 metre sprint and an individual as part of a relay race. This table of comparison briefly goes over what I just discussed in the last 3 slides, but in a comparison point of view. Type 1 has a slow contraction speed, a low fatigue level, has an aerobic metabolism, and produces a low amount of force. Repeated examples include 10,000 meter run and a marathon. Type 2A has a fast contracting speed while still slower than Type 2B, a moderate fatigue level, has both an aerobic and anaerobic metabolism, and produces a medium amount of force. Repeated examples include 400 meter run and an 800 meter run. And finally, Type 2B has a fast contraction speed, high fatigue level, an anaerobic metabolism, and produces a high amount of force. Repeated examples include a 100 meter run and an individual's. Nearly all fibres are used in nearly all sports for the athlete. Type 2B fibres will be used at the very, very beginning to provide a strong, speedy, or good start to a race or an event. These will then slowly deteriorate into Type 2B fibres as the athlete starts to begin to become tired, and his heart rate and his speed and his power output will begin to gradually decrease. Once the decreasing stops and starts to level out, this is when the Type 1 fibres kick in, which will carry the athlete to the finish line, to the end of the race, to the end of the event. Our bodies are capable of 3 types of muscle contractions: concentric and eccentric, which are native to each other, and isometric, which stands alone by itself. A concentric contraction causes tension on your muscle. As it shortens, it produces enough force to move an object. This is the most common muscle contraction. A bicep curl is probably the most familiar concentric movement. When you lift the weight up towards your body, you should see your bicep muscle appear to enlarge as it shortens. This kind of movement is one of the main ways to strengthen your muscles and will result in an increase in muscular size, but not as much as an exercise or workout routine that combines different muscular contractions. Eccentric contractions are lengthening movements of your muscles. During an eccentric muscle movement, your muscle fibers are stretched out due to tension from a greater force than that of your muscle. Using the same bicep curl example we used in concentric, the force required to lower a weight back down to your leg from your upper body is an eccentric movement. You should now notice where your bicep appeared to enlarge originally, the muscle is now lengthening. The combination of concentric and eccentric muscle contractions will produce great results in terms of increasing strength and mass. Unfortunately, an athlete is more prone to injury during eccentric movements. Isometric contractions do not cause a joint to move at all. Your muscles will be activated, but they will not lengthen or shorten. This means isometric contractions are able to generate force and also tension without any kind of movement involved in your muscles. The best example of this particular type of contraction is a plank exercise. The athlete will clearly be able to feel their muscle tensing while their arms remain straight and still. Contraction comparisons. Concentric and eccentric contractions both fall under the heading of isotonic contractions, while isometric contractions are in a league of their own. The main obvious point of difference between all types of contractions is concentric contract by shortening the muscle, eccentric contract by lengthening the muscle, and isometric, while still contracting and tensing, have no movement of the muscle whatsoever. So while concentric and eccentric contractions work with daily movement such as merely walking, isometric contractions work with the daily motion of just standing still. Although concentric and eccentric contractions are 2 completely different types of contractions, they both fall underneath the heading of isotonic. So I think it would be fair if you wish to compare both of the isotonic contractions directly with just the isometric contractions by themselves. When taking safety into account, isometric contractions are the best, as they involve no movement, they can be done fairly safely. whereas eccentric contractions are the least safe, as an athlete is most prone to injury during eccentric movements. One final point of comparison is concentric and eccentric, while concentric a little bit more, both produce a great build-up in strength and muscle mass, whereas isometric produce the least amount of muscle mass and strength by far, as it involves no movement and therefore works less muscles. Antagonistic pairs. Antagonistic pairs are pairs of muscles that work together to bring about movement. As one muscle contracts, this is the agonist, the other muscle relaxes, this is the antagonist. One example of an antagonistic pair in action is the biceps and triceps. When an individual lifts a weight with their arm, their biceps are the agonist as they contract and shorten to produce movement, while the triceps are the antagonist as they lengthen and relax to allow the movement to take place. When lowering the weight, the triceps contract and shorten, while the biceps lengthen and react. Another example is the gluteus maximus and hip flexors. When performing a conversion kick in rugby, the hip flexors are the agonist as they cause flexion at the hip, while the gluteus maximus is the antagonist as it relaxes and lengthens. This allows the leg to move upwards towards the chest. A final example is the quadricep muscle group and hamstring muscle groups in your legs. When footballers prepare to kick a football, their hamstring muscles are the agonists as they contract and shorten to flex the knee, while the quadricep muscles are the antagonists as they relax and lengthen to allow the movement to occur. Muscle contraction process. This process can be explained via sliding filament theory. The first step is where the skin receptors receive a nervous impulse. This impulse as stimulus is sent to and received by the sensory nervous system and is then transmitted out of the central nervous system through the motor unit down to the dendrites. From here, the stimulus travels down to the neuromuscular junction via the axon and its branches as action potential energy. This energy then proceeds to synaptic cleft, where acetylcholine is secreted to begin the all-or-nothing procedure. The all-or-nothing principle states that if the stimulus, which is now action potential energy, exceeds the strength threshold of the muscle, along with a sufficient amount of acetylcholine, all muscle fibers in that limb will contract simultaneously. If the strength threshold is not exceeded, and/or there is not enough acetylcholine, then no muscle will contract.